Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we get into our new episode, let's recap the emotional events from our last story. The entire Bartlett-Flemming clan was finally reunited at the Dude Ranch, but their victory was overshadowed by the public narrative Nathan had created. In a series of quiet, tearful moments, the family began to process their trauma, culminating in a powerful conversation where Jack absolved Ty of his guilt over the fire, affirming that he had saved the true Heartland, their family. The episode ended on a quiet, hopeful note, with Ty and Amy watching the sunrise, battered but whole, ready to face the long road ahead. If you're enjoying this new season, please take a second to hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now, today, the spark of hope ignited by Lou and Peter's desperate plan erupts into a global firestorm, as the world finally begins to learn the truth. The day that followed their return from the mountain was a strange and suspended thing. The Fairfield Dude Ranch, their temporary sanctuary, became a self-contained world, a bubble of a quiet healing adrift in a hostile ocean. They were all together, a precious and miraculous fact that was the central gravitational force holding them all in orbit. But beyond the cozy confines of the lodge, the world still believed the lie. Ty Borden was a terrorist, the Bartlett-Flemming family was a corrupt dynasty, and Nathan Price was a tragic hero. The 24 hours were a blur of a small and necessary moments. Lisa cooked, her movements in the large kitchen a comforting and maternal rhythm that was the heartbeat of the house. Scott, the gentle veterinarian, tended to the various cuts and bruises and exhaustion-related ailments of their small, battered army. The younger children were kept blissfully unaware, their laughter a fragile and beautiful and heartbreakingly normal sound. The adults spoke in low and hushed tones, a constant and anxious counsel of war that was waiting for the next and inevitable attack. The only ones not waiting were Lou and Peter. They had claimed a small office off the main lodge as their new command center. For hours, they had been a two-person army, their faces illuminated by the cool and blue-white glow of their laptops. They had fired their one and desperate and powerful cannonball, leaking the devastating trove of a corporate intelligence to an international journalist. And now, they watched and they waited for the impact. It was just after noon when the first and faint tremor was felt. Lou, who was monitoring a live feed of the London Stock Exchange, let out a small and sharp gasp.
Peter, look at this.
Peter leaned over her shoulder. The stock ticker for Price Industries, which had been holding steady, had just taken a small but significant dip, a single and nervous twitch in the market. It's starting. The story must have broken in Europe. He quickly navigated to the website of a major British newspaper, and there it was. The headline was a stark and beautiful and deeply and satisfying thing. Canadian billionaire Nathan Price at center of massive international fraud investigation.
Oh my God, he did it. The reporter, he actually ran with it.
They called the family into the small office, their voices a mixture of a tense and cautious excitement. The family gathered around the laptop, a small and huddled and hopeful crowd. The spark Lou had ignited was beginning to catch. The story unfolded in a rapid and glorious and global firestorm. The screen became a montage of a pure and righteous and beautiful and long overdue journalistic carnage. The scene cut to a frantic analyst on a New York financial network, standing in front of a wall of a plunging and beautiful and catastrophic red lines. We are seeing an absolute bloodbath in pre-market trading, Bob. Price Industries stock is in a free fall, losing nearly 40% of its value in a matter of minutes on the European markets. The allegations in this report are not just serious, they are a corporate kill shot. The scene cut again, this time to the calm and authoritative anchor of the national news in Toronto, the same woman who had, just a day before, been reporting the story of Ty's villainy. Her face was now a mask of a serious and professional gravity. These stunning allegations of a corporate fraud, backed by what appears to be a massive leak of internal documents, are now raising serious and disturbing questions about the recent tragic events in Hudson, Alberta. Connections are now being drawn between these alleged financial crimes and Mr. Price's ongoing and very public dispute with the Bartlett-Flemming family. Ty stood at the back of the room, watching the story unfold, his own face a mask of a stunned and disbelieving and dawning relief. The heavy and suffocating cloak of the villain, the terrorist, the monster, was beginning, thread by thread, to be lifted from his shoulders. The final and most beautiful blow came from a rival news network. A sharp and incisive legal analyst was dissecting the story, her own expression one of a barely concealed and professional glee. What this leak suggests, Dawn, is a motive, a powerful one. If these allegations of a corporate sabotage and a stock manipulation are true, then the narrative that Nathan Price has been selling to the public, the narrative of a benevolent fiancé trying to save a troubled family, completely falls apart. Instead, what you have is the story of a ruthless corporate predator, a man who is allegedly trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of a family ranch, a man who, when he was met with a resistance, may have escalated his tactics in a terrifying and deeply criminal way. The entire Heartland fire, the public smearing of the Bartlett-Flemming name, it all starts to look less like a family tragedy and more like the final and most brutal move in a corporate chess game. The room was silent. The world, which had been so quick to condemn them, was now, with a stunning and whiplash-inducing speed, beginning to see the truth. Lute leaned her head on Peter's shoulder, a single and silent and victorious tear tracing a path down her cheek. Their desperate and insane and long-shot plan had not just worked, it had been a masterpiece. Ty looked at Jack, who was sitting in a chair that had been brought in for him. The old man's face was a mask of a profound and quiet and deeply and weary vindication. The name he had spent his entire life honoring, the legacy that had been so cruelly and so publicly dragged through the mud, was now finally being washed clean. The tide had not just turned. It was a tsunami, and it was about to crash down on the head of Nathan Price and wash his entire and evil kingdom of Eliza away for good. The small office in the Dude Ranch Lodge, which had been the command center for their desperate media counterattack, was now a theater of a quiet and stunned vindication. The initial and explosive wave of relief that had come with the news reports began to settle, replaced by a profound and almost disbelieving sense of a reality that was fundamentally and seismically shifting in their favor. They were no longer the villains of the story. The world was finally and truly beginning to see the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. The first official tremor of this new reality came in the form of a phone call. Peter's secure satellite phone, the one Val Stanton had provided, buzzed with an incoming encrypted call. He answered, his expression a mask of a cautious anticipation. Vala. He put the call on speaker. Val Stanton's voice, a familiar and deeply and satisfyingly pragmatic sound, filled the small room. It was not the voice of a worried ally, it was the voice of a victorious partner. I assume you're watching the news. Your little firebomb seems to have hit its target. Price's entire corporate structure is in a state of a catastrophic and beautiful collapse. My sources in the Justice Ministry are saying the pressure is immense. They're fast-tracking the review of the arson charges against Borden. It seems having the entire world call you a corrupt monster is bad for a political business. A small and grim smile touched Peter's lips. The game of a power, the one he knew so well, was being played, and for the first time, they were the ones with the winning hand.
So what does that mean for us, Val? For Ty?
It means the official narrative is catching up to the truth. It will be a slow and messy process, but the tide has turned. The world loves a good story, Lou, and the story of a resurrected hero, wrongly accused by a corrupt billionaire who stole his wife and burned down his home. It's a much better story than the one Price was selling. He's no longer the victim, he's the villain, and you are no longer the criminals, you're the heroes, which means it's probably safe for you to stop hiding in the woods. The call ended, leaving a new and hopeful and deeply and unsettling question hanging in the air. It's time to go home. The words were a promise and a threat. Home. The word itself was a ghost, a memory of a place that no longer existed. The idea of returning, of facing the town that had so quickly and so completely turned against them was a daunting and terrifying prospect. Before they could even begin to process the implications, Lou's personal cell phone began to ring. The caller ID was a name she had not expected to see again for a very long time. The mayor of Hudson. She answered, her own voice a cautious and guarded, and deeply and weary thing.
Mayor Thompson.
The voice on the other end of the line was not the cool and evasive and political voice of the woman who had told her that her hands were tied. It was the voice of a woman who was on the verge of a tears. Lou. Oh, Lou. I am so sorry. We saw the news. All of it. The corporate fraud, the lies. We had no idea. We were fools, all of us, and we were cruel. The things that were said, the way this town turned its back on your family, on Jack. There is no excuse. I am calling, not as the mayor but as your friend, to ask for your forgiveness and to ask you to please come home. Your town needs you. We need to make this right. The heartfelt and deeply and emotional plea was the final and definitive and most powerful confirmation of their new reality. The official tide had not just turned. It had come rushing back in, a tidal wave of a regret and a shame and a desperate and public desire for a redemption. Lou ended the call, her own face a mask of a stunned and deeply and conflicted emotion. She looked at her family, at the small and battered and exhausted circle of survivors.
They want us to come back. The whole town. They're planning a welcome.
Tim let out a short and bitter laugh.
A welcome? A little late for that, isn't it? A few days ago, they were ready to form a lynch mob. Now they want to throw us a parade? To hell with them.
It's not their fault, Tim. Not really. They were lied to. Nathan, he's a master at that.
Her voice was a quiet and gentle and deeply and forgiving sound, but her own eyes were full of a deep and profound hesitation. The thought of facing that crowd, of the pitying looks, of the questions, of having to stand in front of the burned-out shell of her own life, it was an overwhelming and terrifying thought. The family was divided, caught between a righteous and understandable anger and a deep and weary desire to simply be left alone. They were a small and fragile and deeply and traumatized group of a people who were not yet ready to be the heroes of a story they had not even finished surviving. It was Jack who, from his quiet and steady and unwavering place by the fire, made the final decision. He had been silent through it all, his own gaze distant, his mind clearly working through the long and complex and deeply and personal history of his own relationship with the town, with the land, with his own legacy. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of the frail and broken old man he had been just a day ago. It was the voice of the patriarch, quiet and firm and absolute.
We're going back.
He looked at each of them, his gaze a powerful and non-negotiable and deeply and loving command.
That is our home. That is our town. Good and bad, it is ours. We will not be driven from it by a liar, and we will not hide from it in a shame. We will go back, and we will hold our heads high. We will face the music, and we will face the ashes, together.
His words, so full of a simple and powerful and unwavering and deeply, and Bartlett conviction settled the argument. The decision was made, they were going home. Jack's decision, once made, was as solid and unshakable as the mountains themselves. The debate was over. They were going home. The hours that followed were a blur of a quiet and purposeful activity. There was little to pack, as they had all been living out of suitcases, but the act of preparing to leave, of consciously choosing to step out of their hiding place and back into the world, was a significant and deeply emotional ritual. The journey back to Hudson was a long and silent and deeply contemplative drive. They traveled in a small 3-vehicle convoy, the same way they had returned from the mountain, but the atmosphere was completely different. The frantic and exhausted relief of that first journey had been replaced by a quiet and heavy and deeply and uncertain apprehension. They were driving towards a home that did not exist, and towards a town that, until just a few hours ago, had considered them to be monsters. Ty drove the lead truck, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the familiar and winding ribbon of an asphalt that was leading him home. He felt a profound and deeply and unsettling sense of a whiplash. Just a few days ago, he had been a fugitive, his face on a wanted poster, a man who was seeing every shadow as a threat, every stranger as a potential enemy. Now he was returning as a hero. The title felt strange and ill-fitting, a costume for a part he did not know how to play. He was not a hero. He was just a husband and a father who had done what he had to do to save his family. As they crested the final hill before the valley that cradled the town of Hudson opened up before them, they saw the first sign. It was a large and hand-painted banner strung between 2 tall telephone poles at the edge of town. The letters were a little crooked, the paint a little smeared by the recent rain, but the message was a clear and powerful and deeply and emotional thing. Welcome home, Heartland heroes. A collective and disbelieving breath was taken in the quiet cabs of the 3 trucks. It was real. The mayor had not been exaggerating. They drove down the main street of Hudson, and the full and overwhelming and beautiful and heartbreaking reality of their new world crashed down on them. The street was lined with people. It seemed as if the entire town had turned out. They were standing on the sidewalks, spilling out into the street, their faces a sea of tears and a smiles and a profound and deeply and communal sense of a shame and a relief. They held signs. "We are so sorry. Hudson loves the Bartletts. Ty Borden is our hero. People began to applaud. A slow and scattered sound at first, and then growing, swelling into a thunderous and sustained and deeply and moving roar. Ty slowed the truck to a crawl, his own mind struggling to process the scene. These were the same people who, just a day before, had been whispering his name like a curse. These were the same streets where his face had been plastered on a wanted poster. The whiplash was a physical and dizzying thing. Mayor Thompson was there at the center of the crowd, her own face a mess of tears and a profound and public and deeply and necessary humility. She stepped forward as Ty's truck came to a stop and the crowd fell silent, a respectful and expectant hush settling over the main street. Jack was the first one out of his truck, his movements slow and frail, but his presence as powerful and as dignified as it had ever been. He stood there, the patriarch of his family, the quiet and steady and unwavering heart of this town, and he simply and gracefully accepted their silent and powerful apology. The family got out of their vehicles, one by one, a small and battered and unbroken line. They were immediately and gently and lovingly swamped. It was not a chaotic or a frantic mob. It was a town, trying to wrap its collective arms around the family they had so wrongly and so publicly betrayed. Neighbors, friends, people they had known their entire lives came forward, their own eyes full of a shame and a relief. There were quiet and heartfelt apologies. There were long and tearful and deeply and healing hugs. It was a raw and beautiful and deeply and messy and completely and utterly and overwhelming public catharsis. Lou, who had been so coldly and so professionally dismissed by her own political allies, was now the center of a circle of a tearful and apologetic and deeply and admiring friends. She was no longer a pariah. She was their leader again, and she accepted their apologies with a quiet and dignified and deeply and forgiving grace. Ty stood by the truck, a small and quiet island in the center of the emotional storm, with Amy's hand held firmly in his. He did not know what to do, what to say. He was not a hero. He was not a public figure. He was just a man who wanted his quiet life back. He just nodded and accepted the heartfelt and awkward and deeply and sincere handshakes and the slaps on the back, his own heart a chaotic and confused and deeply and grateful and profoundly and overwhelmed thing. The public part of their return was a necessary and beautiful and deeply and healing thing, but it was not the end of their journey. After what felt like an eternity, after every hand had been shaken and every tear had been shed, they finally and gently extricated themselves from the loving and apologetic and deeply and overwhelming embrace of their town. They got back into their trucks. The public welcome was over. And now the final and most difficult and most private part of their long road home was about to begin. The part that led to the ashes. The last of the heartfelt apologies and the tearful welcomes faded behind them as their small convoy of trucks pulled away from the crowds of Hudson and onto the familiar winding road that led home. The mood inside the vehicles shifted instantly. The loud and overwhelming and public performance of their return was over. Now came the quiet and private and infinitely more difficult pilgrimage. The air in Ty's truck was thick with a heavy and unspoken dread. Amy sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, a small and steady point of a contact in a world that felt like it was about to dissolve beneath them. In the rearview mirror, he could see the other two trucks, following in a somber and silent procession. They were a family on their way to a funeral, the funeral of a home. They passed the familiar landmarks, each one a ghost from a life that felt like it had been lived by a different family, in a different century. The old oak tree where Lindy had had a tire swing, the gentle curve in the river where he and Amy had had their first and secret picnic, the high pasture where he had so many years ago first seen the wild stallion, Spartan. Every rock and tree and turn in the road was a memory, and every memory was a fresh and quiet and deeply and personal kind of a pain. They finally crested the last familiar rise, and there it was, the gate. The iconic and simple and beautiful wooden gate with the single and powerful word carved into its arch, Heartland. It stood, just as it always had, a proud and stoic and anachronistic sentinel, its familiar lines a testament to a century of a steadfast and unwavering welcome. It was the only thing that was the same. Beyond the gate, the world was a nightmare. The landscape, which should have been a gentle and rolling and vibrant green, was a dead and black and ashen scar. The beautiful and historic main house, the house that had been the living and breathing heart of this family for 100 years, was gone. In its place was a charred and skeletal and hollowed-out ruin, its stone chimneys rising into the sky like lonely and forgotten gravestones. And the barn. The iconic and red and beautiful old barn, the place where he and Amy had first met, the place that had been the very soul of the ranch. It was a blackened and twisted and grotesque skeleton of what it had once been. The hayloft, the place of their own, and very personal, beginning, was a gaping and empty and black hole open to the cold and indifferent sky. The 3 trucks rolled to a slow and silent and final stop, their engines cutting out, one by one, leaving a profound and unnatural and deeply and unsettling silence. The only sound was the low and mournful sigh of the wind as it whispered through the blackened and skeletal branches of the trees that had once shaded the yard. There was no nicker of a horse, there was no bark of a dog, there was no life. There was only the thick and acrid smell of a wet ash and a cold smoke and a profound and absolute and heartbreaking loss. They got out of their trucks one by one, a small and silent and shattered group of a people. They did not speak. There were no words for this. This was a grief that was too deep for a language. They simply stood, a small and broken and unified line at the gate, their hero's welcome in the town, now a distant and hollow and almost mocking memory. This was the true cost of their victory. They had won their freedom. They had won their lives. They had, in the last few hours, even begun to win back their good name. But they had lost their home. They had lost their past. They had lost the one single and physical place in the world that had been the container for all of their memories, for all of their love, for all of their beautiful and messy and wonderful and complicated and precious and irreplaceable lives. The victory was a real and tangible and beautiful thing. But as they stood there, at the gates of their own and private and heartbreaking ruin, it felt like a ghost, a pale and insignificant and deeply and unsatisfying thing in the face of a grief so vast and so profound that it seemed to swallow the very sky. Sources? They stood in a line before the gate, a silent and heartbroken honor guard for a home that was no more. The cool afternoon air was thick with the smell of ruin, a scent that would forever be seared into their memories. No one spoke, no one moved. The sheer and brutal finality of the scene before them was a thing beyond the reach of words, a grief that could only be expressed in a shared and profound silence. After a long and timeless moment, one figure detached himself from the group. Jack Bartlett began to walk, his movements slow and deliberate and heavy with the weight of a lifetime. His family watched him go, a silent and respectful and deeply and understanding audience. This was not their walk to take. This was his. He was the patriarch, the keeper of the flame, and he had to be the one to stand before the ashes of his own and extinguished kingdom. He reached the gate, his gnarled and rancher's hands coming to rest on the familiar and weathered wood. The grain was a map of his own life, a history he could read with his fingertips. He gripped the top rail, his knuckles turning white, the solid and unyielding wood, a single and fragile point of a stability in a world that had been burned to the ground. He looked out over the valley of his own life, and the man who had been a stoic and unshakable pillar of a strength for so long finally and quietly and completely broke. The grief was not a loud or a violent thing, it was a slow and quiet and internal, crumbling. His mind, a traitor in this moment, began to paint the ghosts. He saw the main house not as a charred and skeletal ruin, but as it had always been. He saw a young Marion, his Marion laughing on the porch swing, her face a beautiful and radiant and impossible dream in the golden afternoon light. He saw his daughter Lindy's mother taking her first and wobbly steps on the lawn, her small hand held firmly in his own. He saw 100 small and perfect and precious and now completely and utterly and irrevocably lost moments. He looked at the blackened and twisted and grotesque skeleton of the barn, and he saw a lifetime of a work, of a healing. He saw the hundreds, maybe thousands, of broken horses that had come through those doors and had left, not broken, but whole. He saw Amy, a young girl with her mother's gift, her gentle and patient and miraculous hands calming a terrified and abused animal. He saw Ty, a lost and angry and broken boy, finding his own and very different kind of a healing in the quiet and honest and demanding work of the stalls. He had been so proud of that boy, so proud of the man he had become. And he knew with a certainty that was a fire in his own and weary soul that Ty had made the right choice. He knew that the family, the people, were the true Heartland. He knew it in his head, But his heart, his old and tired and deeply and human heart, was breaking. It was the sight of his own small cabin, or what was left of it, that was the final and most personal blow. It was just a pile of a blackened and smoking rubble. The place where he and Marion had started their life together, the place where he had, in the long and lonely years since her death, found his own and quiet and solitary peace. It was all gone. A lifetime of memories, of a love, of a loss, of a legacy. It had all been turned to an ash and a smoke by the careless and evil and deeply and profoundly and unforgivably and empty ambition of a single and monstrous man. He stood there, a frail and old man, leaning heavily on the gate that was the only thing left of his home. His body, which had been so weakened by the shock of the news, ached with a weariness that was more than just physical. It was the weariness of a man who has fought a long and honorable life, only to see the monument of that life destroyed in a single and senseless and violent night. The episode ends on a final and wide and heartbreaking and deeply and poignant shot. Jack Bartlett, a small and frail and solitary figure, is silhouetted against the vast and beautiful and indifferent landscape of the Alberta foothills and the black and smoking and ugly scar of his own and ruined home. The victory was a real thing. His family was safe. But as he stood there, in the quiet and lonely and heartbreaking aftermath of the war, the cost of that victory felt like a price that no man should ever have to pay.